When we think of the infantry or the foot of the English civil wars, we think of either musketeers or pikemen. But what about archers? And not just archers armoured as pikemen. Don't believe me? Well, take a look at this. Now, the armies of England and indeed Scotland and Ireland in the early 1600s were hardly spectacular. Numbers were small, uniform, wasn't, and equipment was locally sourced and locally financed. In England, James I, and then his son Charles I, had inherited the trained bands from Queen Elizabeth when she died in 1603. The trained bands were local militias, sporadically trained, and only equipped well if the local gentry stumped up the cash for weapons and uniform. One trained band commander described his men as lacking the qualities of sobriety and steadiness of temperament. Fit and able men surely turned out, but it's also documented that with them came the destitute and simple-minded, some bearing archaic weapons, many nothing at all. The training, perhaps 10 days a year, supposedly was to ensure men could stand in the line of battle when needed, and sometimes only constituted 1 day to marksmanship and another to drill. This brief, inadequate training could and did get worse. In 1586, the foot in Lancashire, Cheshire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire enrolled but did not train due to unseasonable weather. In the same counties that year, the cavalry did not train because they lacked cassocks and captains. The Northern Shires reported they only had 1 pound of gunpowder for a fortnight's training. They could only prime their muskets. The Marshal of Dorsetshire also reported to the Queen's Council that the men of Dorset will soon kill one another than annoy the enemy. The array of weapons these men would have been armed with would have made any modern-day army proud. There were muskets, arquebus, bows, crossbows, artillery, maces, long swords, bills, pikes, and cavalry with lances. It would have been a total hodgepodge and would have been a nightmare to keep supplied. In the first decades of the 17th century, wars were raging all across Europe. There was the seemingly unending 80 Years' War of 1568 to 1648 between the Dutch and the Spanish. And to complicate matters, in 1618, the 30 Years' War, the religious war which saw genocide, massacre, and huge battles roared across Europe. These wars would see the pike and musket gain dominance on the battlefield. But in England, we were still seeing how the bow could be improved. Now, the longbow has been seen as one of the great glories of England, the victor of Poitiers, Crecy and Agincourt. In England, it seemed despite the fact the musket was so much easier and quicker to train someone to use, we were still aggressively reluctant to ditch the longbow. So instead of ditching the longbow, could the armies of England combine it with another weapon to increase its shelf life? But which weapon? The musket? Not much point, as it would be adding a ranged weapon to a ranged weapon. But how about adding it to a soldier who could fend off enemy cavalry and fight enemy pikemen? Giving a bow to a pikeman could mean he could shoot arrows from a long distance, shoot individuals at close range, whilst protecting himself, other pikemen, and musketeers while they reloaded. Step forward one William Neade, a man who King Charles I described as an ancient archer. Very little is known about William Neade, or his son William Neade, named as co-inventor of the invention. But they obviously had some influence with members of the artillery garden, and apparently, perhaps reluctantly, the king. Neade was involved in training the London trained bands, after demonstrating his invention before the king at St James's Park in 1625. He equipped 1 soldier in each of the London and Westminster artillery gardens. The artillery garden in London practiced with the combination for a period of 12 months. The king finally gave a royal commission to encourage the use of the invention in England and Wales in 1633. This specified use by all who are to exercise arms in the use of weapons, especially the chief officers and all others of our trained bands. In 1635, and again in 1637, Neade petitioned the king, claiming that he had expended his whole estate of £600 in the process, and no one was using the device. The request was that the Lord Mayor may be ordered to direct the trained bands to furnish themselves with such ammunition, and that delinquents who refuse may be proceeded against. The petition had some success, as in 1637, 300 members of the artillery company, armed with bow and pike, paraded and performed drill before His Majesty. Neade managed to get himself noticed by those whose opinion counted. He cites Captain Bingham of the Honourable Artillery Company, and the approbation of many other honourable commanders. An anonymous author made the comment, "Meanwhile the practice of the bow may be received, though we retain the use of the corselet, for if the one be small encumbrance on the body, and the other will be little burden at the back, and it to rest the left hand on the pike, enable men to draw a stronger bow, that ingenious device of screwing both together will be the best." Neade had a vision of a vast pike block armed with a bow and pike, armoured as well with back and breastplate, tassets and helmet. After shooting from 20 score yards, they would then stop when the muskets were in range. The front ranks would then fasten their bow to their pike, close orders so they were tightly packed, and then come to the charge. Once this was completed, Neade continued, the middle and rear ranks could shoot their volley of arrows and do good service, whereas without their bows they can do nothing but stand with their pikes sloped or at the port. Not only did he come up with the idea of these combined arms and the strange device which somehow attached the two, but also 16 postures for drill, 5 of which were specific to the bow. The other basic pike movements were well known to soldiers of the period. He also suggested ideal situations where these new troops could prove effective. Tasks such as guarding convoys or powder stores. These would normally be done by men armed with wheellocks or early flintlocks. The idea being to keep burning slow match away from flammable fodder and vast stores of gunpowder. Neade was obviously not only keen on his idea, but must have firmly believed in it, for he produced a book in 1625, the year Charles I came to the throne, and in it argued strongly in favour of his invention and showing the drill, as well as a letter answering criticisms of the device. Alongside this, he held a patent monopoly on the manufacture for 14 years, from 1634 until 1648. In one plate of his book, The Double-Armed Man, Neade shows a soldier with a pike at the order, with a short bar joining the pike and bow. The other plates in Neade show the relative positions of the pike and bow for different postures, and allow the degrees of movement to be inferred, but do not show any detail of the device itself. It seems that the bow is completely free to rotate in one plane only, about the axis of the device. Neade also invented and patented a grinder for manufacturing the device. And it seems that it was not just Neade who saw a use for this new invention. Robert Ward in 1631 wrote, "This invention of joining the bow to the pike may be of excellent use in the wars." Even after the start of the English Civil Wars, notable men were passing comment. Captain William Neade wrote, "And if by frequent practice they were inured to the use of the longbow fastened to the pikes, they would not only be a terror to their enemies by the continual showers of arrows, which they will send amongst them, but also they would be in great means to rout their battalions and utterly break their order. And in the time of stormy wet weather, these bows would do great service when the musket cannot be discharged for the rain." He goes on to suggest that the pike drill should be learned first, before complicating things with both bow and pike. Neade included the double-armed man in his otherwise normal manoeuvres in chapters 76 and 77, noting, "The pikes, after sending their showers of arrows, come to the shock, and so try the fortune of the day." It wasn't just theory and practising in the park. The Earl of Bedford, fighting in 1642 on the side of Parliament, encountered a body of troops on the approaches to Hertford. At the entry of the town stood the whole trained band as a full body placed in a warlike equipage. He was by them conducted to the second watch, being a company of pikes with bows and arrows. Thomas Venn was still talking about the combination nearly 50 years later. He wrote, "I could therefore say much for the longbow to be joined with the pike, how their showers of arrows will gall and terrify the horse, wound and hurt the soldiers, both on horse and on foot." But just how popular was archery at the beginning of the 1600s, and was Neade merely dreaming about his new invention? At the turn of the century, an entry appears for "payment made to Mr. Bolter, Master Bowyer, for £4, 18 shillings and 4pence, for repairing and straightening 295 livery bows, being before unserviceable." This shows that bows were still thought of sufficient consequence to be repaired. These bows were then stored in the Tower, and were likely to have been in the order placed under Elizabeth. In Repton, Derbyshire, mustered militiamen had a coat and bow, and a sheaf of arrows, and a quiver. In the reign of James I, and as late as 1628, Sir Philip Carteret wrote that Jersey had a force of 3,000 able-bodied men for the defence of the island, of whom 300 were armed with muskets and pikes, the rest having bows, bills, or unarmed. As late as 1638, the Earl of Arundel at Carlisle requested "some quantity of bows with offensive arrows, that they should be poured into the bordering shires of Cumbria, Northumberland, and Westmoreland." In 1621, a committee advised the Lord Mayor of London that 4 regiments or companies of archers should be formed, but nothing appears to have been done. The same year, the Lord Lieutenants of counties were directed to see that of the newly levied men, 12 out of every 50 were to be archers. The Honourable Artillery Company practised archery in and around London in the early 17th century. Patents were granted by James I in 1605 and Charles I in 1633 to restore the Finsbury Fields to the state they were in during the reign of Henry VIII. The owners had put up fences which interfered with the archers' marks. Charles I issued a commission in 1638, ordering the statute of Henry VIII for the maintenance of archery, and 2 other statutes of Edward IV and Elizabeth, respecting the importation of bowstaves by merchant strangers, to be enforced. As the Civil War started in 1642, archery again was given a boost. A party of the King's troops are said to have been met armed with bows, and archery is mentioned as having been used at the sieges of Devizes and Lyme. In 1643, a company of archers was raised within London, being based at the aptly named Bowyer's Hall, within Cripplegate and a nearby church. The archers met on Mondays, Thursdays and Saturdays, while the trained band met on one Sunday a month and holy days. So returning to Neade's invention, Charles himself had a go, and was impressed enough to commission William Neade and his son to provide training and instruction to the county militias in the use of the double-armed soldier. William Barif wrote, "In all these firings, the pike never come to charge, but stand in a square battle, in danger of the enemy's shot, themselves neither being able to offend the enemy nor to defend themselves. And yet if, by frequent practice, they were inured to the use of the longbow, fastened to their pikes, I made no question but that, when they should become expert in the use of the bow and pike, they would not only be the terror to their enemies by the continual shower of arrows which they would send amongst them, but also that there would be great means to rout their enemies, and utterly to break their order." The most significant attempt to reinstate the longbow came in 1627, when King Charles's favourite counsellor, the Duke of Buckingham, raised an army to attack the Isle de Ré in support of the French Huguenots at La Rochelle. Orders from Buckingham were sent out to the counties for the levying of men, and it was stipulated that 24% of them were to be archers. In some counties, the order for archers arrived too late, and the force had already set off for the embarkation points, and in other counties, not enough archers could be found to fill out the quota. Nevertheless, bows and arrows were ordered from the Tower, and archers were reported assembling at Portsmouth, but exactly how many made it to France is unclear. but French sources reported arrows being shot into the fort of St. Martin de Ré. In many years prior to the Civil War, there were plenty of longbows in circulation, and not just a few archers. With 300 men trained in the use of the pike and longbow in London, and given William Neade's commission from the king, it is reasonable to suppose that at least some trained with them throughout the provinces. In the period leading up to the beginning of the outbreak of the war, King Charles issued commissions of array, ordering his supporters to raise troops in their local areas for his service, and they included provision for archers. The commission sent to the Marquis of Hertford, for example, to raise troops in the West Country and Wales, instructed that he raise an army consisting of horsemen, archers, and footmen of all kinds of degrees, meet and apt for the wars. During the same period, a company armed with pikes and longbows in Hertford, specifically for defence of the town, when they believed the town was under threat of attack from a royalist force. The local parliamentary commander, the Earl of Bedford, sent a party of cavalry under Captain Ankle to boost the defence of Hertford, and when they approached the town, they were met with pickets posted on the outskirts of the town, but having given the password, they were admitted. Ankle's cavalry were then met by a second watch, being a company of pikes with bows and arrows. Another company of archers was raised on behalf of Parliament in Shropshire. Troops stationed in Bridgnorth were expecting the arrival of the Earl of Essex, when instead a royalist force under Prince Maurice arrived. Cavalry was sent out, but a large force of royalist musketeers under Lord Strange took up position just outside the town and drove the cavalry back. Fearing that the triumphant royalists would drive home their success by fording the river and entering the town, the defenders with bows and arrows sent to them, which did so gall them, being unarmoured men, that with their utmost speed they did retreat. In the early months of the war, there is evidence of formations of archers being assembled, and in at least one case, used in action during the defence of towns. Archers may have been a reasonably common feature of sieges on both sides of the conflict. At the siege of Gloucester in 1643, bows were used to shoot messages in and out of the besieged city, and according to Peter Gaunt in his book The English Civil War, A Military History, messages were shot by longbow into Basing House by parliamentary besiegers in 1644. Also, at the siege of Lyme Regis in Dorset, the royalists shot fire arrows into the town and set alight the good number of buildings, and there is additional evidence of arrows being used for sending messages as late as 1648 in the sieges of Colchester and Pembroke. In September 1643, the parliamentarian newspaper Mercurius Civicus reported the news from Oxford. It read, "The Royalists have set up a new magazine without Norgate, only for bows and arrows, which they intend to make use of against our horse, which they hear, though to their great grief, do make much increase, and that all the bowyers, fletchers, and arrowhead makers that they can possibly get the employ and set on work there for that purpose. Also, that the king hath 2 regiments of bows and arrows. It is therefore necessary that no arrowheads be suffered to go from London towards Newbury, or into any other parts where the cavaliers may by any means come to achieve or surprise them. And it were to be wished that the like provision were made by the Parliament here to get bows and arrows, at least some for their pikemen, it being not unknown what victories have been formerly achieved in France and other parts by our English bowmen, besides the flying of the arrows are far more terrible to the horse than bullets, and do much more turmoil and vex them if they enter." The fact the king had 2 regiments of archers is unlikely, but that fact that it was printed in 1643 indicates that it was not considered unlikely at the time, and the fact that the movement of arrowheads was to be restricted suggests that there was at the time a supply worth restricting. The most intriguing thing perhaps about this article is that the bows and arrows were for supplying the pikemen, thus suggesting that the double-armed man was still considered a possibility in 1643, and may have been what was meant by the ambiguous reference to the company of pikes with bows and arrows in Hertford in the previous year. Importantly, the rallying cry of Mercurius Civicus for a parliamentary force of archers was heard in the highest circles. Thomas Taylor served as a lieutenant under Colonel Fiennes at the siege of Bristol, and was called as a witness by Fiennes to appear at his trial for surrendering the city too early. When he first gave his deposition, he was a lieutenant, but by the time of the trial he had been promoted to captain. As well as his promotion, Taylor was also given his own command. Whereas by virtue of a commission, under my hand and seal, dated the 1st day of November, 1643, directed to Mr. Thomas Taylor, citizen of London, he the said Thomas is authorised to raise a company of archers, for the service in hand, and to set the same on foot, by and through the free bounties of the well-affected people, in and about the city of London, the parts adjacent, as by the tenure of the said commission appears. It has been said that the last significant use of the longbow in a battle in Britain occurred at Tippermuir on the 1st of September 1644, when Montrose's Royalist Highlanders defeated an army of the Scottish Covenanters commanded by the Earl of Wemyss. The Highlanders were still well known for their use of the longbow at this time, and at Tippermuir the Atholl and Bannock men had swords, bows and firelocks. In the Bishops' Wars of 1639-40, longbow-armed Highlanders had played their part, and from that conflict comes a wonderful description of the kind of men who fought at Tippermuir. They were all or the most part of them well-timbered men, tall and active, apparelled in blue woollen waistcoats and blue bonnets, a pair of bases of plaid, the stockings of the same, and a pair of pumps on their feet, a mantle of plaid cast over the left shoulder, and under the right arm a pocket before their knapsack, armed a pair of dirks on either side of the pocket. They are left to their own election for their weapons. Some carry only a sword, others a sword and targe, others muskets, and the greater part bows and arrows, with a quiver to hold about 6 shafts, made of the mane of a goat or colt, with the hair hanging on and fastened by some belt, or such like so as it appears almost a tail to them. Whilst Montrose and Wemyss were battling it out, on the same day the Earl of Essex was losing the Battle of Lostwithiel in Cornwall. Whether Thomas Taylor's company of archers took part in the battle is unknown, but there can be little doubt that having been raised by Essex the previous November, they almost certainly went on to join his army for the West Country campaign of 1644. However, they were probably knocked out of the fighting in the West Country in August 1644. Royalist troops plundered Llandudrop House, the home of Parliamentary Colonel Lord Roberts, and in the house was found many bows and divers of arrows. There is no evidence of Thomas Taylor's company of archers after August of 1644, and it appears likely that if they had survived the long march out of Cornwall following the defeat at the Battle of Lostwithiel, they were probably incorporated into another regiment and re-equipped with pikes or muskets, or maybe even disbanded. The use of the longbow did not entirely disappear with Taylor's company, as there is evidence of its use by Parliament at both the sieges of Colchester and Pembroke, as well as the Royalists still having archers in the field in 1647, when James Winston, a parliamentary soldier, was wounded in the right hand by an arrow at a skirmish at Hathersage, Derbyshire, but this is the last known acknowledgement of the longbow's use. For our video on the grisly death of a Royalist soldier with his hands being hacked off, click here. As always, thanks for watching.